The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 8, 61 Meteor. The battalion did not rest long, but it was better than nothing. As soon as the mech was dissolved, and the 1,000 soldiers appeared, they immediately got to work. They knew their duties well. About 300 of them deployed tents from their personal spatial tools and entered before going straight to sleep. The tent, simple and compact though they may seem, were actually fitted with a sound insulation formation, as well as an alarm function in case of combat nearby, so they were well suited for such situations. The remaining few either stood guard, or began to cook large, nutritious meals. The meals were not elaborate. In fact, it was a fixed meal called everything stew, in which they boiled whatever rations they had directly within bot lamdu. The bot lamdu was technically no longer useful in healing now that they were within the Foundation realm, but that did not mean it had no effect at all. It was great in relieving accumulated physical stress, not to mention that it tasted great and served as an excellent base for soups and stews. That, when mixed with the highly nutritious vegetables, herbs, and spirit treasures that they either collected from various planets or bought from the Alliance, resulted in a meal that was both delicious and extremely potent in re-energizing them. Cooking the stew, even on high heat, cultivation-powered flames, took an hour, since all the vegetables needed time to cook and soften up. Once prepared, the guards and those on cooking duty ate, after which the first 300 were finally woken up. They had in no way had enough sleep, but such things were already luxuries they could no longer afford. The other 700 then took out similar tents and went to sleep while the first 300 then ate and stood guard. This was a routine they had perfected during their many deployments, and had used on many occasions. Such an occasion gave them the perfect opportunity to accumulate stories which they would later regale the future generations with, starting with the phrase, "back in my day." But secretly, they enjoyed it. The mech spread its wings and jumped high into the air, before flapping its wings and taking flight. For some reason, flying was extremely intuitive, as if the information for flight and navigation came alongside the wings. Without flying themselves, the Marzu were able to keep pace with the mech as they sprinted in a straight line towards the next monument. With a speed that it had never reached before, the mech reached the next monument in just over an hour and, surprisingly, discovered another army waiting for them. But from a distance, the army seemed even bigger than the one they had faced before. "Can you prevent my attacks from causing space tears as well?" Z asked Feor. "Yes. We're already doing it, no need for concern." It was not just Z that smiled upon hearing that, but the mech itself as well. For too long, they had been holding back. Finally, they could let loose now. Purple flames enveloped the flying mech. Like a shooting star, it streaked across the sky, and like a meteor, it crashed directly into the enemy's defensive formations. Though no tears opened, as the Marzu had promised, the ripples in space seemed to travel across the entire planet at that moment. Yet the fight was just beginning. Chapter 862 Z's Tiny Big Ball. The formation stood no chance against the mech assault and easily broke. Countless demons also suffered under the first assault, though they were already retaliating. The Marzu seemed to ignore such feeble attacks and directly ran into the army, much as they had done previously. Z grinned as an idea struck him. Although the battalion really should have been saving its energy, Z had been feeling oppressed for too long. He could not help but want to unleash the attack he had been holding on to for so long. The flames covering its body concentrated onto its left hand, while streaks of electricity began to dance around his right hand. The mech raised its hands above its head, allowing the flames and electricity to travel from its arms into the air. The two extremely volatile forms of energy seemed to combine effortlessly and began to gather into a massive ball. "Z, I told you not to use this," Luther said admonishingly from within the mech as he observed what was happening. "Just a small one, I promise," Z said, his eyes gleaming with a frenzied energy. A layer of earth traveled over the mech's feet and across its body towards the growing ball of energy above its head. A number of other unique powers gathered and fed into the ball. It was tragic that Z could not feed the ball with his space abilities, but such was life. Just as a small amount of each of the energies merged into the ball, Z stopped growing it. After all, if he made it too large, it would be a drain on the Mech Zone energy reserves. "Big ball of ultimate destruction," he roared, although a number of the battalion members cringed, both at the action of announcing his attack and the name itself. "Shall we move to the next monument?" he asked sheepishly. Before Feyor could answer, the sound of shattering glass filled the air. Sensing extreme danger, the group looked over at the blue barrier and discovered a figure floating above the barrier, wearing a gray robe. That was quite impressive. The scale of that attack actually reached the mid-nascent realm, the figure said. He waved his hand again, and the entire barrier shattered. Yet instead of a chaotic storm releasing once the stopper was removed, the scene seemed to be completely frozen. "Your little performance actually forced me to move a little earlier than I planned," the man said. "Though that's not too bad. This is quite useful." All the energy within the sealed zone seemed to gather into a tiny yellow flame, flickering on the tip of the robbed man. All the Marzu, as well as the mech, looked at the robe figure solemnly. The aura that the figure radiated was actually less than that of the two devils they faced previously. But somehow, while being weaker, he seemed even more dangerous than the previous two devils combined together. "Rejoice, for your souls are to be sacrificed in honor of a great deity." The figure crushed the flame within his fist, yet somehow lit up the entire sky as he did. A gold light painted the entire sky as divine energy filled the sky. "What is happening?" asked one of the retreating Marzu as it panicked. The situation had changed so drastically, so quickly. "It's a religious zealot," Feyor answered with gritted teeth. He's been using the souls of the demons we killed and preparing for a ritual. The previous attack must have disturbed him, forcing him out of his hole. We only have one chance to stop him. We have to." Before Feyor could finish her words, the robbed figure appeared in front of her and her body froze. Chapter 863 Chaos. Time seemed to slow down, as everyone had their eyes fixed on the grey-robed figure. Nothing of his actual body could be seen, but the shape of his hood indicated a humanoid or elven appearance. He spoke not with his voice, but by emitting a strange, psychic energy that stung whoever it hit, while at the same time transmitting his thoughts. It was for that reason that everyone in the vicinity heard everything he said. The most peculiar thing about him, despite the fact that he was obviously incredibly powerful, was that he radiated no cultivation at all. It was as if he was a mere mortal. But though he had no cultivation, seemingly, his body did emit a kind of energy that Z was familiar with. It was divine energy, used by both angels and deities. The figure, who had appeared in front of Feyor, seemed to use some kind of ability to freeze her entire being. Not only did she stop speaking mid-speech, her body stopped emitting magical energy, as if it was frozen in time. An atypical Mazru. How curious. Are you from a famous or noble clan? The stability of your power seems to suggest your changes are not a random mutation, or at least not a harmful mutation. Is that what allowed you to keep space from tearing? What a curious ability. The figure stepped onto her snout and walked forward slowly, as if on a stroll. The other Marza did not respond kindly to such actions, nor did Z wait to let the figure complete whatever it was doing. Battlefront 00974, Alliance Headquarters. "This doesn't make any sense," said an elf as he looked at conflicting reports. On one hand, all the reports from the sector near BGY 987 seemed within expectation. The battle reports and progress updates did not show any deviation from what was expected based on the ongoing situation. On the other hand, after a more thorough scrutiny of the situation, they realized that it was practically impossible to contact specific personnel in those locations. For example, other than those responsible for regular communications, if someone wanted to talk to a specific soldier who was deployed there, some issue would come up as to why they could not be contacted at the moment. They might even be declared MIA or KIA. Such a thing was also normal, but only within reason. If no one from within that entire sector could be contacted, then there was clearly an issue, and it did not take a genius to figure out what that issue was. Either their communication department was compromised, or their intelligence department. It may very well even be both of them. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, the elf grabbed all the reports and quickly made his way to the senior-most officials of the entire alliance. They were supposed to be an elf and a dwarf, but as was seen throughout the alliance, the dwarves rarely held down office positions. Almost all of them were deployed, rather than being bunkered down in headquarters. "Sir, there is an issue, just as you suspected," the reporting elf said, handing over his reports. The senior in charge, as a celestial immortal, read through the documents in a mere moment. "Issue new orders. I want to know what the situation on BGY 987 is immediately." Both the elves could feel a headache coming on. On one hand, a discrepancy on a war front with the Fugan would be investigated by the Hanali. On the other hand, whoever sent them that threatening letter was clearly upset with what was happening on that planet. That meant that the situation was already out of hand. After careful consideration, the celestial elf decided to go get his own battle armor. Perhaps it was time he joined his dwarven compatriot on the front line and earned some merits before someone came to penalize him. Chapter 864, Studying Space. The Blink module's failsafe has been automatically activated. "The space in front of us is too unstable to facilitate teleportation," Cirque said as he read out a report. Though, at this point, Lex did not need Cirque to tell him. With his affinity for space, he could feel how it behaved in this region. He found that calling unstable might be incorrect. Instead of feeling fragile or unstable, it seemed stretched. "Activate the Kelvaha Spectre Talisman," said Lex, not letting his observation distract him from the matter at hand. "How long do you think it will take until we reach them?" "The Blink module did not get us as far as I had hoped. Now it all depends on how quickly the talisman can help us move. Until I experience it, I cannot say for certain. But, if I were to make a guess, based on the information you've given me about the talisman, I'd say 8 more hours. 8 more hours. Lex repeated as he mused to himself. The space in this region was extremely unusual. Normally, Lex would not be confident enough to determine what was unusual and what wasn't, but he had recently bought a manual for space affinity from the emporium that he had been studying. With not much to do on the ship, Lex occupied his mind with various things. He practiced his swordsmanship, but that was not enough to completely occupy his thoughts. So, at the same time, he perused the manual. Even then his actual understanding was minimal, but it allowed him at least to differentiate between unstable and stretched. It seemed as if someone or something had stretched space in this region to blanket over something, thereby hiding it from being accessed or viewed. Of course, he could be spectacularly wrong about that. He was still a beginner at this. But, oddly enough, his instincts, which had slowly begun to be less useful as of late, seemed to indicate that his theory was right. He looked out of the cockpit into the infinity that was outer space. They had already used the talisman, and were traveling in a manner that eluded their comprehension. Their surroundings seemed to be changing each moment, like a sequence in a badly edited video rather than passing scenery. Clearly the talisman was in use, but Lex felt no different. Cirque, who was navigating, may be feeling the true effects of what using the talisman was like, but Lex did not distract him with questions right now. The pilot had to ensure that they reached their destination timely. The talisman would not last forever, so they either had to make the most of it, or reach their destination before its effects elapsed. He turned his gaze back to the manual and began reading. He wanted to fully understand everything he could about space so that he was ready to face whatever obstacle he faced when he reached BGY 987. Although a lot of time had passed, the anger he had been harboring had not dwindled. In fact, due to the long time, it had only grown stronger and more overwhelming. But his firm control over his mind, practiced to control the sword in his soul, kept that anger in check. Soon, it would be time to let it loose. But not yet. While Lex was studying, and the battalion was fighting for their life, a group of devils suddenly teleported within the Midnight Inn. They exchanged no words, and instead began to spread out silently, as if they had a clear purpose in coming here. No one seemed to find anything amiss. After all, a majority of the guests at the inn were devils. What could be so different about this group? Chapter 865 Retribution came wearing slippers. The mech suddenly fell out of the sky and into the army of void dwellers. Mental exhaustion was setting in, so Z was slow to react, but fortunately, he managed to avoid getting hurt. He used his shield as cover as he slammed into one of the large void dwellers and stabbed his spear in its body and used it for support to slow down his descent. Just as they had suspected, the strange robed figure teleported them to another battlefield just as they began to thin the first army. He did not even wait for the fight to finish. The moment the number of demons they were killing was reduced, he appeared again and teleported them to another monument, disappearing in the process. The problem he was facing was not the long battles or the endless enemies. Instead, it was that the enemy seemed to be preparing his attacks specifically in the other battlegrounds. For example, this time around, the stronger demons all had armor specifically designed to stop the penetrating force of his spear and shields to block his energy attacks. Even the attack patterns of the Marzu had been thoroughly studied and accounted for. Naturally, that did not mean that the mech and the formidable Marzu lost all battle capabilities, but that the impact of their attacks was drastically reduced. If previously the mech could continuously injure numerous giant demons and slowly tire them out, now it was a challenge to injure even one as they had adopted various defensive tactics. In fact, they were not even trying to attack them non-stop, as they had previously been. Instead, they were just trying to tire them out, and it was working. The mech took flight using his wings, trying to get some distance so that it could deploy some long-range attacks. But the wings, which had been powered by an external source, suddenly disappeared, resulting in the mech from falling from midair as it did. The moment the mech reached the ground, it withdrew the spear from the void dweller and used its body to attack all the enemies surrounding it. But Z's exhaustion began to reveal itself in small but significant ways. He did not notice how the ground he landed on felt unusually light, so when it collapsed underfoot he was taken by surprise. Nonetheless, he had sufficient skill, so he was able to jam his spear on the side of the tunnel he was falling into, and immediately pulled himself out. The action barely took a moment, but was enough to allow his enemies to surround him. A majority of them held up their shields, as if ready to deflect his attacks, while a couple of them attacked him with long-range weapons, safely nestled behind their partner's defenses. At the same time, they could no longer be concerned about the dangers of void tears. If they held back even a little, their own survival would be at risk. So, if there was risk either way, they chose the method that would devastate their enemies the most. Pamela, the combat medic, focused completely on helping Z, leaving herself completely unprotected. It need not be said that the battalion trusted each other unequivocally. This is bad, Luther. Z has lost consciousness and isn't waking up. Forcefully disrupting his connection with the mech seems to have injured him gravely. Take all the time you need, Luther said calmly, as if they were not surrounded by thousands of enemies. But confidence alone could not remedy the situation. Luther took in a deep breath, preparing himself to push himself to his limits, and beyond. Z had done the best that he could, now it was his turn. It was then that an unusually violent spatial wave went over the entire battleground, coming from up above. Wary of more enemies, Luther looked up. But instead of more enemies he saw fireworks. It was not just Luther who looked up in confusion. Many demons, void dwellers, and some of the other races who were hiding on that planet all looked up. One after another, distant sparks lit up in the night sky, a few flaming streaks falling through the sky afterwards. It was only after a few of such fireworks went off that Luther realized what he was really looking at. It was not fireworks, but exploding ships in space. A thought suddenly struck Luther, and he immediately used a spiritual technique to zoom in on the space above this accursed planet. He saw hundreds of ships flying and shooting at a black blur, chasing it down. Yet none could come close, and not a single one of their attacks hit. Instead, it was a second, smaller blur, that zoomed through the vacuum of space and tore through the many ships. Recognizing a familiar suit, Luther could not help but smile, and then burst out into laughter. His purple flames enveloped him as he walked away from the battalion. The only thought on his mind was to give out a signal to let the reinforcements know where he was. Yet even as he walked into the madness of an army of demons and void dwellers, the last sight he saw could not help but continue to make him laugh. It was not just an oh so familiar suit that he saw. He saw the figure of a man, a devil's mask on his face, making him look like death incarnate amongst the debris of all the ships he destroyed. But the most significant thing he saw was the man wearing bathroom slippers on his feet as he zoomed through space. The flames around his body rose into the sky, the heat from the flames once again causing the air to move out rapidly. A tornado of purple flames was once again formed, marking where the battalion was on the planet. Chapter 866 Massacre. As time went by, Lex became completely focused on reading the spatial manual, so much so that he even stopped simulating his sword training. Even with his elevated mental capacity and increased intellect, studying the manual was a difficult task. Space was an esoteric concept, wielded by many but mastered only by a very few. Although the book only barely scraped some of the topics, Lex's imagination could not help but run wild. He tried to imagine how he could use his affinity to create spatial items, as theoretically at the nascent level he should be able to do it. He also tried to visualize, based on these concepts, what it would mean to open up minor realms, or how a new realm was formed in the first place. The key point, governing everything, completely immovable and immutable, was time. But since this manual was about space, besides barely mentioning its relation, the book did not elaborate on time at all. So engrossed was he in his studies that when Cirque first nudged him, Lex did not even notice. Realizing the state of his companion, Cirque nudged harder and spoke up. "This talisman is working a lot better than I had imagined. We've already reached the vicinity of BGY 987. I just need to lock down its location and approach. We could be there in a matter of seconds to a few minutes." Lex immediately snapped the book shut and looked up into space. There was not much to see besides darkness, but Lex could see a lot of red, as if visualizing the blood that was about to be spilled. Without saying a word, he exited the cockpit and walked into the storage room. He checked his attire, but he was already wearing his defensive suit, so there was not much to do. The one change he did make, however, was removing his shoes and putting on the bathroom slippers instead. The slippers, as unassuming as they seemed, provided Lex with complete protection from environmental threats. It seemed simple, but the ability was far more impressive than it appeared. Lex did not know what he would face when they approached BGY 987, but he had to be ready for a quick exit from the ship. Whether it was to confront any enemy spaceships, or to land onto the planet as quickly as possible, he would need to exit the ship. That meant, for an undetermined period of time, he would be exposed to the vacuum of space. One would think that, with Lex's highly strengthened body, that should not be an issue. One would be wrong. The vacuum, a realm of unfathomable terror, promised an instant onslaught on his exposed form should he enter unprepared. In that abyss, pressure would tear at his body, siphoning every trace of moisture, sizzling fluids into vapor. Assuming that he would be able to protect himself using his defensive techniques would be a mistake. The ship evaded, clearly able to detect approaching artillery, but it was for naught as the weapon was on a timer. Just as it passed by, it exploded, releasing a bright light that blinded anyone looking. Lex was naturally not looking, as he was already zooming towards another ship, ready to attack again. Yet his intention to unleash his entire payload changed when he felt space itself shake under the might of the previous explosion, forming a wave that spread out. Cracks formed at the site of the explosion, and a tear in space appeared, revealing the void behind it. As if pulled out by the suction of space, an army of void dwellers burst out from the hole. The many dangers of space did nothing to them, as they came from an even more perilous place. But nonetheless, they were destined to be nothing more than floating space trash, as they had no way to propel themselves in space. Lex's mind raced as he observed the space wave, comprehending the situation. It made sense that strong attacks could not be used. That was the very reason the system would not allow his innkeeper to descend to this place. The space was too fragile. But he was not beholden to the rules of the system, and he could not care less what happened to this space. A nefarious smile bloomed on his mask as Lex altered his plan, and hundreds more missiles appeared beside him. The space wave finally reached Lex, but instead of being affected by the distortion in space, Lex used his absurdly potent spatial affinity, and used space itself to propel him forward. Seemingly surfing on the wave that flowed through reality, Lex approached the many spaceships. In comparison to their massive bodies, Lex was naught but space dust, but as soon as the ships saw the weapons all around him, many of them immediately retreated from that very space dust. Many of them shot at him, hoping to use the destruction of space to harm him, but how could Armageddon be stopped so easily? Without a thought or care, Lex launched his weapons at all the ships around him even as he flew towards them at his full speed. In the silence of space, Lex orchestrated a brutal massacre, forming a symphony of spatial waves and ripples that he used to his own advantage. Countless lasers, bullets, rockets, and even Void Dweller approached him, yet with his technique that allowed him to adjust his movement at a mere thought, he dodged them with ease, leaving behind only his enemies' regrets. As if learning from him, one of the missiles seemed to be timed, and exploded right beside him, but could not even wrinkle his suit. Cracks formed all around him, threatening to tear open and pull Lex into the void itself, momentarily giving his enemies hope. But before the tear could form, domination rose out of his body and spread all around him, suppressing even the distortion of space. He glanced at the cracks and, as if afraid of him, the cracks retreated into nothing, as if they had never been there. Then the massacre continued. Chapter 867, Putting on a Show. Fighting in space was unlike any battlefield he had ever encountered. It was not just the weightlessness, lack of sound, or the need to be extremely conscious of any and all momentum transfer. The scale of the battlefield was larger than any he had ever been in, but more importantly, it extended in every axis. There was no up or down, high ground or low ground. He had to be aware of everything in every direction, with countless ships that could travel entire miles in seconds, or even less. No matter how fast Lex was, he could not match the speed of the ships if they tried to run away from him. Fortunately, they were just as keen to attack him as he was to destroy him, albeit they tried to keep as much distance as possible. Lex's space affinity, which was drastically greater than that of Z's, allowed him to do things that the latter could not, which was why his battle strength was not compromised at all. In fact, one could even say that his battle strength improved drastically in this zone where piercing through space was easy. One particular ship, much smaller in size than the rest, but also more nimble, decided to opt for the exact opposite style of attack than the rest. Dodging all the space debris, as well as the countless attacks flying through space, it approached Lex. The pilot was hoping to take advantage of being close to prevent Lex from throwing any more missiles or tearing holes in space, as that would compromise his own safety. At the same time, he hoped to use the tough body of the ship to slam Lex. But a few ships, who were mimicking the first ship by coming close, immediately deviated and began flying away from Lex. This was not a man in a devil mask, he was a true devil. Lex, I found the battalion on the planet and am descending, Cirque said, speaking through a talisman Lex had given him before. This specific talisman would allow the two to communicate with each other mentally even at a distance of 100 miles. The battalion is at the location of the purple tornado. Lex turned towards the planet and his gaze immediately locked onto the whirling, majestic purple tempest dancing across its surface, its vivid hue contrasting against the grays and browns that filled it otherwise. His eyes gleamed, but he did not rush towards the battalion. Instead, he looked back at the countless ships in space, with more approaching from far in the distance. You go, I'll cover your retreat, said Lex, as he summoned the weakest rocket he had stolen from the dragon's hoard. Remember, this one has a rupturing law frozen inside. Once it is unleashed, the devastation that has been frozen will wreak havoc without constraints. It's difficult to determine the extent of its power, but the law will barely last for a second. If you're within the blast radius, you'll die immediately. If you're even a millimeter outside the radius, you'll be perfectly safe, reminded Pell, as it saw its master take out a powerful weapon. But Lex needed no reminding. He had already asked the ring before, and knew that the estimated blast radius would be 500 miles at most. Of course, he did not plan on being anywhere even double that distance when the bomb went off. He strapped it to one of the more tame missiles he bought from the Emporium, before summoning 300 more of such missiles. Without hesitation, he launched all of them in random directions towards the many approaching ships, before hurling himself towards the planet at full speed. Chapter 868. There is no lingering danger at all. Many hours had already passed since the particular group of devils entered the inn and split. During this time, they did nothing suspicious. They merely roamed the grounds of the inn, separately, as if exploring the wilderness during an adventure. Oddly, though, that abruptly ended when one of them spotted Velma. The devil stayed in the distance and only watched, but the rest from his group seemed to stop their wandering, and converged towards him. Since he was following Velma, from a distance of course, when they would finally meet, the entire group would be near Velma. As for what would happen afterwards, only the devils themselves knew. Lex did not plan an elaborate reunion, nor was he intending on a long, drawn-out play for revenge. As angry as he was, he knew his first priority was to get the battalion back to the inn. It was exactly for this reason that he was willing to take a risk with the stronger missiles. Of course, the situation here was precarious. With space ripping apart easily, the influence of an attack on an immortal level will not be small. Oddly enough, Lex, who was looking away from the explosion and rushing at his fastest speed, did not sense the abnormal cloud of light that was forming behind him at all. It was as if only those looking directly at it could perceive it. What he did notice was an abnormal absence of spatial waves, despite the time for the explosions elapsing. Whatever the case, he would not stop to investigate now, as his instincts were unusually silent. He did not detect any danger behind him, which was strange. After all, even if the explosion did not take place, there were countless enemy ships behind him. But his instincts gave him no warnings. But sometimes, depending on the circumstances, no warning was actually warning enough. What kind of danger could surpass the detection level of his instincts entirely? He did not want to wait to find out. It did not take long before he felt the gravity of the planet start to affect him, and felt his return to the atmosphere. The return of sounds was the most pleasant part of his journey, as he had to actively avoid paying attention to the sound of his own blood coursing through his veins, which was all he heard in space, accompanied by his heartbeat of course. The technique he used to move around in space lost its potency, but that did not matter as Lex had aimed his body well. He was falling directly towards what he could now see was a massive army, surrounding the battalion and attacking at every moment. The fact that they were not in their mech form told of how bad their situation must be. If Lex had delayed any longer, it no longer mattered. Ignoring the flames forming around his body, Lex began to gather his spirit energy into his arms. Having a massive army around the battalion was clearly not good for teleporting back, so first he would kill them all. The strange lack of danger behind him urged him to rush as much as possible. So, without waiting for a superhero landing, Lex gathered his spatial affinity in his hands like he had done before, and once again summoned a blade made of space. With a form that was much improved from the one he used in space, Lex once again swung his sword. The army was too far away, so the sword could not reach it. Lex had not manifested sword intent either, so he couldn't use that for long-range attacks either. Instead, he used the tiny space blade in his hand to cut through space itself. Chapter 869. Mere Minutes of Chaos. As someone very new to using a wide array of fighting techniques, Lex was testing out things as ideas came to him. Besides impervious hands, his most commonly used technique, evisceration, and now most recently domination, Lex did not have many ways of attacking. As a result, much of what he was doing was based solely off of his theoretical knowledge of his skills and affinities. Ordinarily, it would be impossible for someone to take pure theory and implement it flawlessly. But nothing about Lex was ordinary. As he swung the blade made of space, he used his affinity to his absolute limit as he tried to manipulate space with it. As if he were dragging a blade over glass, cracks started to form in air that began to rapidly spread. Moving even faster than the descending Lex, the cracks traveled in a straight line across the path Lex had swung in, and descended down to the planet, and then through it, forming an artificial wall of cracked space. The wall was so massive that all stopped their movements. Whether it was the demons, the devils, the Marzu, or the battalion, they all froze as they tried to comprehend what had just happened. No one dared to move, as the wall of cracks was too massive. If this wall were to crumble and open up a tear in space, let alone the entire planet, this entire star system may be compromised by the tear. Moreover, a tear of this size would not heal on its own either, and would instead continue to grow bigger. This could literally destroy a massive chunk of space forever. Even the zealot, who was observing everything secretly as he prepared his ritual, felt fear. Immediately, he decided to forego his original plan and proceed even as unprepared as he was. He was not afraid of dying, but dying a stupid, worthless death was not what he wanted either. But Lex was not suicidal, and would not kill everyone before he rescued the battalion. What the observers did not know was that this wall of cracked space was actually quite sturdy under the influence of Lex's affinity. But as a result, Lex, who hardly ever suffered from a deficiency of spiritual energy due to his massive reserves, suddenly used up half his energy. The demons, though, they did not respond so well to the healing winds that came from within the clay. Though a majority of them were on the other side of the spatial wall, protected from the winds that seemed to be unable to cross the barrier, a good few thousand of them were on the same side. They felt an instinctual fear and dread take hold of them when the clay was broken, but while there were some enemies they could fight, they had not yet learned to fight the wind. They found themselves defenseless against the winds that carried the grace of Botlam, and were akin to mortals before the might of nature. The winds did not waft across them, but hit them like a natural calamity. The unlucky ones lived long enough to groan and scream as their flesh burned and turned to ash. The lucky ones were dead before they even knew what happened. In mere seconds, a massive army was erased from existence, not even their armor surviving as a testament of their existence. Anything and everything which contained the aura of demons vanished under the effects of the wind. Cirque did not really pay attention to the spectacle he had released, instead he quickly found Gerard, as Luther was fighting far away from the battalion so as to not hurt them. "Recall everyone and stay ready. Leo will stabilize this space and give everyone an opportunity to use their keys to return to the inn. We cannot waste a single second. It might not be so easy," Gerard began to say, as his thoughts quickly wandered to the zealot and their allies who were waiting for them back at the fort. He did not think the former would let them leave so easily, while he did not want to abandon the latter. "I'm just the messenger," Cirque quickly interrupted Gerard, as he drew out a weapon of his own from his spatial ring. "If you have any concerns, tell Leo. He's the one running this operation. Until he arrives, just get ready." Gerard did not hesitate and immediately gave out orders. Luther was far away from them, and was fighting demons on the other side of the spacecrack wall. Instead of asking him to come, it would be easier if they just went to him. With renewed vigor and might, the battalion took their positions and prepared themselves to march. They could see their comrade tearing through the sky in a ball of fire and heading towards them. As soon as he landed, they would immediately surround him. Hardly a couple of minutes had passed since Lex's arrival, but the situation had changed drastically. Even the figures watching from the dark room were on the edge of their seats, as if watching for the crescendo of this grand finale. But the situation was much more chaotic than it seemed. In a dark corner of this planet, the zealot plunged his sword into Feor's skull as he initiated the ceremony prematurely. Up in space, the cloud of light reached its critical point, and suddenly started to contract in on itself. Instead of disappearing, the fragmented law trapped within that missile seemed to be growing stronger, and was instead taking on an elven shape. Chapter 870 Overworked Teenager. Lex's instincts, which had been as silent as a docile and frightened puppy, finally acted up, though Lex was not surprised. He immediately felt danger surrounding him, and a sort of timer, which was counting down with barely any time on it at all. This should be the trap, or perhaps even the first of many traps that were waiting for him. Lex scoffed and turned to look at the invisible formations that surrounded this planet. He knew his every action was being monitored, his every word being heard. The enemy was still watching, silently learning everything about him. But was he not doing the same? He channeled his spirit energy into his left eye and closed his right now. The world looked more vibrant than ever and revealed more than what was there. He saw the weakness in everything, and the strength it could display. He saw the potential everything carried and understood how it could be achieved. He always knew his left eye was special, but it was only once he asked Pell that he realized what its true ability was, and what he was really looking at. He had gained a weak version of something that was usually only attained by a few extremely gifted immortals. He could see hints of the laws that were contained in everything. As a result, he could see the natural path of progression for every object, peer into a few secrets, and learn how to destroy or strengthen anything he looked at with ease. For example, a treasure that was actually simple but hid a deep secret could not hide from Lex, for no matter what kind of method it used to hide its secrets, it could not hide the laws that made it up, as well as the secret. With the ability of his left eye, when he looked at the world, all its secrets were revealed to him. He could see various points across its surface where certain laws gathered, trying to pierce through the veil of reality. Those monuments were not just to send the planet into the void, but to a certain location within the void. Clearly, the enemy had planned or prepared something at that spot. He saw, in a distant corner, far away from the battalion, a well of tainted light. It was a type of divine energy, but feeble and forcefully collected. He saw a curse, hiding in the depths of the planet, sealing something deep within its core. It seemed this plant itself was suffering from the influence of a curse, though that seemed to be old. He saw. It did not matter. With his clear understanding of this world, he formed an array around himself. It was weak, weaker than it was supposed to be, a fault of this uniquely weak space, but it got the job done. The array had only one function, to speed up Lex's descent and guide it to a specific location. Lex, the flaming comet descending from up above, was supposed to be a couple of minutes away. That would have been enough time for the battalion to gather near the cracked space wall and wait for it to recover so that they could approach Luther. Of course, such an effect would only occur in normal space. In this region, the talisman could not even achieve half of its effects. The reason Lex had strengthened the space around the group, even if just a little, was that he wanted the talisman to focus specifically on that region alone. If the talisman were not enough, he was ready to use the wine bowl as well. There were no visible effects of strengthening space, but the members of the battalion who had a space affinity felt a subtle change in the region. With trouble literally on the horizon, as the pale divinity was about to reach them, and the unknown state of what was happening in space, Lex did not dare delay. Immediately he threw out golden keys, making sure each of the Marzu got one. The battalion members already had their own. Crush your keys and return to the inn. Luther will stay with me to rescue your remaining allies, but we will join you shortly. As if sensing the urgency in his voice, some of the battalion members immediately tried to crush the key. If the surrounding space was too unstable, then the key would not break. But, as if fate was finally giving them a reprieve, the keys were crushed. A number of them disappeared. What about me? Cirque asked, in case his aid was still needed. You leave too. The more people I have to protect, the harder it will be. In that case, good luck, Leo, said Cirque, before crushing his key as well. The rest of the battalion members did not hesitate either. Since the order had been given, they crushed their keys, all disappearing, except Z and the Marzu. We cannot abandon Feor, one of the Marzu said looking at Luther, though the fear and hesitation in his eyes was evident. If she's alive, I'll save her. Otherwise, then there's nothing I can do. If you don't want to go, I won't force you, but just be aware that I can't solidify space again and again. You might lose your chance to escape if you don't go now. Just as the Marzu were hesitating, and speaking with one another through their spirit sense, Z stepped forward, looking at Lex oddly. Boss, is that you? Z asked with the awkwardness of a teenager working a part-time job in front of their boss. Gone was the confident, battle-hardened Z. Instead, the overworked teenager seemed to have returned. Chapter 871, Countdown. Lex looked down at Z, and found that the scrawny kid had actually grown much taller recently. It was not just his improved cultivation that affected his height, or the fact that many months had passed. The extreme stress he had been under caused his body to constantly push itself to evolve. He was nearing 6 feet, 1.8 meters, and his frame was filling out, although his face still retained his youthfulness. Looking at Lex, Z seemed hesitant with slumped shoulders, but within his eyes Lex could see a deep fierceness that seemed even more aggressive than Luther's. Clearly, every one of them had grown in their own ways during this time. What relieved Lex, however, was that the stress of war did not distort his personality. The fact that he could still behave so timidly in front of Lex spoke of how he had clung to his original personality. Yet as happy as Lex was to see his store manager once again, this was really not the time to catch up and reminisce. It's me, Z. Unless there's something important, we should talk at the inn. This space will only last for a dozen seconds or so, said Lex out loud, so that even the waiting Marzu would decide on what they wanted to do. It is important, Z said, regaining some of his confidence as the topic diverted towards important matters. I didn't focus on it before, because our survival was at risk, but now there's a chance. I can feel a connection to something hidden. I can feel a call, as if something connected to me is hidden just out of view. Every time space cracks appear, or a new space tier opens, I can briefly feel that connection. I don't know what it is, or how it's even possible that something can be connected to me, since I've never left the inn before, but my instincts tell me it's something very important. I can barely contain myself from responding to the call every time I feel it. Lex, who was keeping an eye on the ever-expanding divine energy, and calculating various other potential dangers, paused his thoughts as a certain gleam passed through his eyes. Z could not think of why he would be connected to something outside the inn, but he certainly could. All the workers at the inn were actually clones of others. If Z felt a connection to something, then it was probably something related to the person Z was originally cloned from. Lex did not have any particular interest in the history or background of his workers' original bodies, for that had no reflection on his workers whatsoever. Although, he had to admit that each and every one of them had phenomenal potential. Whatever gene pool the system was drawing from was of the highest tier. After a few mental calculations, Lex looked at Luther. Change of plans. Z will come with me, you head back to the inn. Our return might be slightly delayed. The moment Lex finished his sentence, Luther grappled with overwhelming mental conflict. No matter how anyone else judged Luther's leadership, the fact that he had not foreseen the trap coming, and over the past few days could only struggle against the odds as he waited to be rescued, left him feeling inadequate. Luther was supposed to be the innkeeper's secretary and assistant, but he could not even do this much. He felt defeated. The sole consolation he had was that at least no one died under his watch. 3, 2. You feel safe attacking us outside the inn, because you think the protection of the inn does not extend here, Lex said aloud, knowing that his voice could clearly be heard by whoever was watching. But did you ever stop to think that, outside the inn, the innkeeper won't stop us from hunting you down and getting our revenge either? 1, 0. The divine energy finally encompassed the entire planet and a profound change took place. The noble aura of a deity descended, and shocked every living being on the planet like a clap of thunder right beside one's ear. All the demons and void dwellers were immediately stunned, freezing where they stood despite the compulsion of any orders they may have received. The Marzu, taking Lex's advice, left and so were saved from enduring such a corrupted majesty. The few elves, minotaurs, and other races that defended the fort were similarly stunned, as if they lost their very ability to think and perform actions. Only a few devils who were spread across the planet, the Zealot, as well as Lex and Z, were able to endure and retain their thoughts. Among them, Z only survived due to Lex enveloping him in domination. This ability could not only intimidate his foes, but empower his allies as well. Just as Lex was on the verge of cursing, realizing that it was impossible to reach the battalion's allies in time to save them, he saw a new law beginning to affect the planet. From his left eye he saw the law descend from the sky like rain, and target every living being on the planet. Most laws for him were difficult to fully comprehend and identify, even if he could innately identify their weaknesses, but this one he was all too familiar with. Something was teleporting all beings, and bringing them somewhere. Lex immediately stopped running, and allowed himself and Z to be influenced as well. "Come Z, let me show you how you should thwart your enemy's plans in the future," he said before their figures disappeared. In the dark room every single figure watching the projection felt their emotions undulating. The words of the man wearing a devil mask were clearly targeting them, and his unique choice of wearing a devil's mask when facing a conspiracy formed by a devil spoke of deep implications. Were they in danger? While everyone else was fearing for their lives, only Rocketfellow and the Zealot were experiencing different emotions. The Zealot was suppressing his rage and regret-filled scream. Thousands of the inn's employees had escaped. How was he to get his revenge if they all escaped? If he had not been so thoroughly suppressed earlier, he may have gone on a rampage. As for Rocketfellow, he was simply smiling. "Lex Williams, he murmured, looking at the mask. Chapter 872 Too Unreasonable. When Lex and Z reappeared, they found themselves amidst a crowd of millions of demons. They were of all shapes and sizes, large and small, and bore a faint resemblance to whatever organism they had been before the demonic conversion. Clearly, everything that had once been alive on this planet had been turned into a demon, though he could not understand why. As confident as he was in the battalion's prowess, even they could not fight forever. With so many resources available, the mastermind only needed to use them in a slightly more effective manner to completely overwhelm the battalion, yet he had squandered them. But that no longer mattered. "Find your allies," Lex said to Z as he turned his attention to something else. Despite the presence of so many demons, and no doubt void dwellers and other beings, just out of sight, there was an odd silence in the area as every one of them was subdued by the aura of divinity. Up ahead, in the distance, was a massive altar where a massive statue made of a deep red stone had been erected. The finer details of the statue were difficult to perceive, but the body of a man and the head of a hawk were easily identifiable. Behind the state, a massive creature had been strung up, its feathery carcass dripping with blood that flowed out of a hole in its skull. The blood fell at the statue's feet and then seemed to be absorbed into it. From so far away, Lex could see that a robed figure kneeled on the altar and worshipped it zealously, screaming something as he did. His voice did not carry from so far away, so Lex had no idea what he was saying, but it was enough to identify him as the enemy. By the way, lesson number 1 of thwarting enemy plans. Never let them complete their monologue. It frustrates them to no end since, generally, they crave recognition for their evil plans. Using his left eye, Lex could tell that an enormous amount of divine energy was filling up the red statue, and that it seemed to be the focal point of whatever was happening to the planet. So, true to his words, Lex leaped forward, intending to break the statue with a punch. Courting death, the Zealot roared the moment he saw what Lex was doing and attacked him. The hood had fallen off his head, revealing a dried-up skull with extremely prominent veins all over it. A few of those veins had popped due to Lex's punch, leaking out the dark brown sludge it was carrying within. The Zealot had no cultivation, but the strange divinity he held within his body empowered him. He formed a scythe of pure energy and swung at Lex's neck as he channeled more of energy to try to hold Lex down with its aura as he did the others. But with his defensive suit accompanied by his domination, nothing could influence Lex. He completely ignored the scythe and allowed it to try to cut him, only for it to be deflected away by his collar. His suit, despite being incredibly soft to wear, was not something to be taken lightly. Lex's punch connected to the statue, but the divine energy contained within seemed to act on its own, to protect the statue. Blasphemer! Heretic! I will feed your soul to the fires of hell, the zealot screamed as he attacked Lex again. But Lex completely ignored him and allowed his numerous attacks to fall onto his suit. Instead, he focused completely on destroying the statue, as it was increasingly feeling more and more ominous. In the back, Z was watching, flabbergasted. Wasn't Leo's defense just too unreasonable? Chapter 873 Silent Oath. In space, the elven figure made of light was becoming smaller and smaller. Yet as its size decreased, the shape of the figure became more and more distinct. The entity that Pelvalen had believed was a broken law started to regain a hint of sentience, both due to its gradual recovery, as well as the fact that it sensed a threat to its existence. Space seemed to be cracking around it as its size decreased. Clearly, its existence could not be supported in this place. Yet, conveniently, it sensed a deity's domain encompassing a planet nearby. With no real thoughts developed as of yet, the figure of light acted on instincts and moved within the domain, finally allowing the space in the vicinity to rest. Of course, now the pressure of its existence was being borne by the deity's domain. But, as of yet, it did not have enough intelligence to worry about such things. At the altar, the situation was becoming more and more chaotic. Just as the deformed zealot was unable to harm Lex, Lex seemed unable to harm the statue. There was a massive well of divine energy contained within which it was using to defend itself, and the divine energy kept increasing instead of decreasing as time went by. Lex did not need a thorough investigation to figure out that the increasing divinity came from the blood of the Marzu hanging behind the statue. Lesson 3 of Thwarting Your Enemy's Plans: you need a thorough understanding of your enemy's actions, and what motivated them to begin with. That zealot is somehow generating divine energy through the death of countless beings. I believe that when the zealot arrived on this planet, he was probably very weak, without any cultivation of his own. That is also why he never acted against anyone before. He was silently using you to kill as many as possible, so that he could harvest as much energy as possible. Whatever ceremony he has started also requires an immense amount of divine energy, so he's killing all the demons himself. He's hoping to speed up the ceremony, and use its effects to kill us. So now, my question to you is, how do we complete our objective and simultaneously stop the enemy? Z did not hesitate in answering. Our first priority is saving our allies. We can send them to the inn, and then find a way to disrupt the ceremony at its foundation, the statue. You're right. But you're also wrong, said Lex as he grabbed onto the youth and rushed towards their previous allies. If you're feeling extremely gracious, one way is to send all the demons here to the inn as well. With no beings to kill, his plan will fail on its own. But I'm not so keen on sending the very demons who were hunting you down to the inn. Since this entire planet is full of enemies, with only a few remaining allies, there's a much simpler solution. Rescue the allies, then destroy the entire planet. Just as Lex finished his words, he summoned another one of Pelvalen's missiles. He did not know why the previous one had not delivered its devastation yet, although he was quite sure it would eventually erupt. That did not mean, however, that he could not just use another missile. Whether it tore up space or not would not matter if he targeted the planet itself, right? Z, who was up until now focusing on Lex's words, suddenly trembled. He made a silent oath to never miss a day of work in his life. Of course, you can also take advantage of a few uncertain elements as well, Lex said as he suddenly turned his head and looked to his left. In that direction, a new group had just been teleported over from somewhere on the planet, and within that group Lex sensed multiple powerful beings. A single glance was enough to tell Lex that there were over a dozen devils amongst that group, and they all looked like they were struggling against the suppression of the deity's aura. Chapter 874 Devil's Throne. Although Lex had spotted the devils, they had not spotted him yet. They were all struggling against the divine aura, but the moment they were teleported over, and found themselves amidst an endless sea of stunned demons, they stopped holding back whatsoever. The devils transformed. Their aura immediately erupted as 17 devils roared out in anger. They had come to this planet to hunt, and instead were the ones being played with. But while the devils regained their ability to move around freely, the demons around them still did not heed their commands. After all, they could not move at all. Lex did not stop moving, but instead of going over the sea of demons, he decided to be a little more discreet and travel on the ground. He even withdrew the missile he planned on using. If he could get the devils and the zealot to fight each other, something unexpected may happen. He did not need to do much, besides stay out of sight and not attract attention. The zealot was blaring his aura in full as he carried out a massacre, and thus easily attracted the attention of all the devils. Without hesitation, the devils spread their wings and took flight, ready for war. A few moments later, the thunderous sounds of a massive brawl echoed across the expanse, alongside the frequent earthquakes. "Do you think they can stop the zealot?" Z asked. He was feeling incredibly strange, which could be determined by the fact that he was casually asking questions even in such a serious moment. They were not out of danger, and if anything, were in much more danger than what the battalion was facing before. Yet he felt none of the associated pressure, or even urgency. It was as if he was completely safe so long as he stayed beside Leo, which made no sense. After all, it could be easily seen that Leo himself could not effortlessly resolve every issue, or else he would have destroyed that statue. He knew this. But feelings were not the most logical part of the human experience, and Z felt incredibly safe at that moment. No, they can't. It's not that the zealot is strong, but that he has too much divine energy. Even if I kill him in one hit, he will immediately come back to life, because it's not his soul sustaining him, but the energy itself. Unless the devils can deplete his energy or sever their connection, they can't do anything to him either. "You vermin! Do you know what you've done?" the devil, still somehow alive, screamed as his body began to grow under the effects of its transformation. "Of course I know what I've done," Lex answered as he summoned a dagger from his spatial bangle. This was one of the weapons he bought from the Emporium, and it could theoretically even pierce the skin of an immortal. All Lex needed was for the immortal to hold still while he tried to stab him. But with the devil, this was not an issue. With machine-like precision, Lex stabbed the knife directly into the devil's spine before it completed its transformation. The devil screamed again, but Lex showed no hesitation as he systematically crippled the devil. Not only did he sever many important nerves, or the devil equivalent, but more importantly, he cut all the meridians within its body. Within a couple of minutes, the devil was completely crippled without any ability to retaliate in any way. The only thing he could still do was to use its mouth to curse and threaten Lex as it tried to comprehend the horror of what had happened to it. "Continue to rescue the rest, there are no other devils amongst them," Lex said, not even turning to look at Z. He had not massacred nearly enough enemies to sate his boiling anger, but his cold, calculating mind kept him from acting out. He had to focus only on what was absolutely necessary. When he finally got hold of the devil, Lex still did not vent his emotions. Contrary to what it may seem like, Lex did not torture it for his personal satisfaction. Instead, it was to leave it vulnerable as he extracted information from it. He slammed his domination down on the devil, finally putting an end to its endless curses, and put his fingers on the devil's temple. His fingers seemed to blur and enter the devil's mind as he used mind meld to transform bits of himself into thought. This was a surprisingly useful ability, and it made interrogation much easier. But Lex had not fully mastered it, or even attained great proficiency in it yet. He had not had much opportunity to experiment with this ability, so he could only use his intuition as his guide as he sifted through the devil's memories. He had killed the elf he had been disguised as and infiltrated the battalion stronghold. Yet oddly enough, it had never acted against them. It was as if the devil was only there to watch, or perhaps he was a part of some contingency plan. He delved deeper to peer into his secrets, but suddenly found his memories changing. The landscape of his mind slowly began to darken, as if he was losing his thoughts or memories completely. Instead, a massive throne was forming from their fragment, positioned right in front of Lex. A massive devil appeared on the throne, and looked down on Lex with a charming grin, as if he was genuinely happy to see him. Once again, Lex's instincts failed to warn him of any danger, but his own common sense told him that the appearance of this devil was likely due to some protective techniques used on the captured devil's memories. Chapter 875 Devil's Bane Dagger. Compared to the enormous throne, Lex seemed like an ant. The devil sitting in the throne seemed both grand and menacing as it looked down on Lex. The surrounding darkness wrapped itself around the devil's face, so only his eyes were visible, but the rest of his figure could easily be seen, as if it was fully illuminated. The devil clearly seemed to enjoy the feeling of Lex looking up at it, and even leaned forward so that it could bring its face right above Lex, forcing him to arch his neck even further. But while the devil reveled in his sense of superiority, Lex was indifferent to the size difference. Once one had stood atop a dragon, the size of things hardly seemed to matter anymore. "You," the devil began to say, stretching out his words as if building anticipation, "are distracted." Outside the mind of the devil Lex was invading, the devil had quietly and secretly healed. Although he was not back in his prime, it was enough for him to move his tail. The tip of his was sharper than a sword, even, and stabbed Lex right in the heart, or tried to. All it managed to do was ruffle his suit a bit. Within the mindscape, Lex continued to look at the devil indifferently. Clearly his plan did not have the effect he sought. Devil's Bane Dagger would not have worked on the zealot or the statue, which was why Lex had not used it earlier, but the devils who had incredibly resilient bodies were prime targets for it. He turned back to Z, who was still sending away his remaining allies. "We have sent away anyone we could, and we can thwart the enemies by sending a powerful rocket their way. Now the only thing left is to figure out how we are going to access the place that you felt a connection from. Any ideas?" "I can feel it. The place is nearby, but it's hidden or just out of reach. Every time space tears, I can feel its entrance, but the space tears always open up to the void. The opening is somewhere in the cracks, where space is splintered, but not quite all the way to the void." Z's explanation reminded him of the sensation he had earlier, where he felt that the space here was stretched over something, as if to hide it. "Although I understand what you are saying, I have no way of reaching the place. Read the manual I gave you and see if you can figure something out. Since you're the only one who can feel the connection, you are the only one who can open up a door to that place. I'll protect you as long as I can, but I don't know how long that'll actually be." In the distance, he could see that more and more divine energy was accumulating in one point, the statue. The devil besieging the zealot had not slowed the accumulation of divine energy in any way. Instead, it had sped up the process, no doubt due to the collateral damage from their fight. As if sensing that the situation was about to get much worse, Lex took off his blazer and dropped it on Z's shoulders. "Here, put this on." The young man was quite strong, but was not strong enough to casually tolerate the defensive blazer that had been designed from Lex. His knees buckled and he fell to the ground, but fortunately, he had caught himself before he face-planted. Chapter 876 The Sudden Change. An unusual situation came about as Z sat cross-legged on the ground, wearing a blazer that practically caused him to bend until his face was almost touching the book he was reading. Around them stood the formidable demon army that had been created specifically to hunt them down, yet they did nothing except stand still. Lex stood beside him cross-armed, waiting for something to happen. Realistically, it was impossible for Z to master space well enough in a short enough time that he would be able to open a door to the place he felt a connection. What Lex was hoping for, instead, was that he would be able to resonate with that place, somehow triggering a door or invitation of some kind. Of course, it would not do to tell his own employee that he had no faith in him, so instead he waited in silence. The seconds ticked by, each seeming to extend forever before giving way to the next. Slowly, those seconds turned to minutes. Z was focusing his utmost and reading as quickly as possible, in a rush. He had no idea when death and destruction would rain down on them, so it would be best if could leave before then. For a short while, nothing happened. Their presence remained undetected to the devils fighting far off, and so there was no one to bother them. But, ultimately, a change did come, and it came abruptly and on a massive scale. Without forewarning, the red statue erupted in a cataclysmic explosion of light that blinded all, and it was followed by an unearthly wail filled with both anger and anguish. "I can smell that place on you," a voice roared, filled with a lust for vengeance. The previous blinding light was so strong even Lex was forced to close his eyes, but pure instinct guided him to use impervious hands and bring his right hand in front of his face. His timing was perfect as a fist seemingly made of light landing right in his hand, packed with all the strength it could muster. Before Ra could continue screaming, Lex used his left hand, still empowered by impervious hands, and grabbed his beak, shutting it. "What was lesson number 1, Z?" Lex asked without looking back. "Never let the enemy complete their monologue." Z responded promptly, as if he was ready for a quiz. For the first time in days, Lex smiled. "Good." Lex freed his right hand and stepped forward to deliver a punch right in the deity's stomach, causing it to lurch backwards. But with his grip on Ra's beak, it could neither grunt nor escape from him. "You should have learned the first time, Ra," Lex whispered in his ear, more than happy to tolerate the momentary rejection from the world. "Don't mess with the Midnight Inn." He did not know how to kill a deity, or more likely a projection or perhaps clone of a deity, but with his left eye he could see the weakness of this body of light it was inhabiting, so he did not hesitate. He pressed his fingers against Ra's chest, and slowly yet forcefully, pushed his hand inside the deity's body. "Unhand my lord," came a yell from a distance as the zealot flew towards Lex at its fastest speed, 17 devils on its trail, but Lex did not break eye contact with Ra for even a moment. He finally felt like he was punishing those, or at least some of those, who had targeted the inn. The anger he had been nestling for so long did not allow him to look away. Chapter 877 Torn Shirt. "Huddle yourself within the blazer," Lex said to Z through his spirit sense, though his gaze was still locked onto the deity he had captured. Without his blazer, the defense of the remainder of his suit was compromised, but that hardly mattered. After all, the suit still did not reach the level his own body was at. A second later, the zealot finally caught up to him and delivered a devastating blow to Lex, careful not to harm Ra. Unlike the punch he had blocked, this blow was more than enough to launch the 700-plus lbs, 317 kilograms, Lex off the ground and into the demons around them. But with his unrelenting grip, Lex brought Ra with him even as he was hurled across the field. In fact, Lex's smile widened just a bit as this happened. It was not because he was hurt, but because... "No. My lord. Unhand him, you fiend," the zealot wailed, his voice filled with anguish at realizing he had contributed to the harm of his lord. But Lex did no such thing. He did not even respond. His focus was solely on digging his hand deeper into Ra's body, as he knew this state of weakness he was in was ephemeral. Even as he reached for the core hidden deep within the deity's body, Lex could feel it growing stronger. The divine energy constantly being fed to it was slowly making the body stronger. As soon as the deity had just enough spare energy, it could retaliate with something more than its feeble brute force. Lex was actually a little lucky that Ra had chosen to attack him directly in its anger, instead of biding his time till it gained some strength. This chapter was first shared on the NOV-LSS1N platform. The landscape changed. The ground quaked. Space itself once again began to moan. But Lex remained undeterred. Seeing how their attacks had no effect, and how Lex was not retaliating, the devils became a little more bold with their attacks. The prior issue of the enfeebled space which prevented them from using their full force was gone, for now, so they did not hold back. Soon, they were throwing their strongest attacks at him, some of the more confident devils even coming close to attack him physically. Yet nothing worked. The more Lex remained undeterred, the more the devils felt afraid. They began coordinating their attacks, unleashing power that was impossible to do on their own. Like salvation coming just as they teetered on the edge of oblivion, there was finally a change. Lex's shirt began to tear. It's working. His defensive equipment is giving way. Keep at it. Noticing the situation, even the infuriated RA saw some hope, and looked at Lex with eyes filled with nefarious anticipation. The moment it was free, it would teach this feeble rat what it meant to cross a deity. It would imprison his soul and torture him for all eternity. Ignoring the gloating eyes of RA, Lex continued to dig his hand into his chest. It was a touch process because each second, Ra's body was becoming stronger and more challenging to pierce through. But he was almost there. Far off, Z continued to read the manual hurriedly, ignored by everyone. Huddled as he was in the blazer, no one had noticed him at all. With Lex's body being thrown away by the first attack, the battle had actually moved far away from him. But on a battlefield of this scale, the only contribution he could make was to quickly figure out a way to reach the space where he felt the connection. Chapter 878 I'm an atheist. A volcanic rage filled the zealot's eyes as he guzzled up divine energy to fuel the endless barrage of attacks raining down on Lex. All his abilities, which used to severely diminish his foe's fighting force if not completely cripple it, seemed completely ineffective against Lex. The aura could not restrain him, the attacks could not hurt him, the curses could not reach him, and his threats did not faze him. He seemed uniquely equipped to combat divine energy, something that was almost impossible to accomplish ordinarily. But even then, he was bound to fail. The zealot revealed an ugly, distorted smile as he saw how the devil's attacks were slowly tearing his shirt apart. At first it was just his collar, but now his cuffs and even the back seemed to be suffering under their combined effort. If Lex still had his blazer, it would not have been so easy to achieve, but since he took it off himself, he had to live with the consequences. Truthfully, his suit had not been too useful up until now. Most of the time, he faced foes much stronger than him, to whom his suit was little more than paper to be torn through, or his enemies were far too weak and were disabled from his aura alone. This was the first time he was up against enemies near his own cultivation level, mostly because of how the space in this region could not have supported stronger beings. The pit that Lex was standing in had now become a black crater, its surface charred under the relentless onslaught against a single man. It almost seemed like the world itself would collapse before he would. Almost. Mad laughter echoed through the air as the red-eyed zealot rejoiced, his dried and shriveled face revealing an ugly sight, even in the face of joy. After a particularly powerful attack used jointly by 10 of the 17 devils, his shift finally tore off. What was revealed beneath was a perfectly sculpted body, without a single blemish or bruise to mar the sublime sight. His rippling muscles looked more divine than the divine being he had gripped in his hand, and for some reason, the effect of his domination increased noticeably. Just as a flicker of his confidence returned, Lex chuckled. The tip of his middle finger finally touched the core within Ra's chest. You know, on Earth, I actually saw your statues in person once when I visited Egypt, said Lex softly. I was not too impressed back then. I'm not so impressed now, either. With his finger firmly pressed against the core, Lex finally took action. Using his eye, he could see that the weakness for this projection of RA was the core in his chest. As long as he destroyed it, the clone would also cease to exist. The only caveat with that was that the core was not so easy to destroy. Fortunately, due to Lex's abundant experience, he came up with a better solution. Instead of destroying the core, he would absorb the energy inside of it to improve himself. If he could do that with a living dragon, Lex saw no reason why he couldn't do the same with a living deity. Once, long ago, he had improved his body using the essence of a deceased deity. Now, he wanted to see how the energy of a living deity would improve him. He began channeling his cultivation technique, and the extremely powerful and potent divine energy that enabled the deity to exist was forcefully absorbed into his body through his finger. In disbelief, RA roared, "Dio, you know your blasphemy. Such sacrilege will not be forgiven by any deity." That's okay, Lex replied casually. I'm an atheist, anyway. I never cared much about what the deities thought. Chapter 879 A Nightmare Come to Life. Lex tuned out the ranting voice of the deranged deity as he felt his cultivation technique absorb the strangely warm, slightly scalding energy. For reasons beyond his understanding, Lex found himself reminiscing at this moment. He could not help but think back to his life just a couple of years back. His daily routine was filled to the brim with dissatisfaction from start to finish. He would wake to the annoying, piercing ringing of his alarm, just short of getting enough sleep. He would spend a decent amount of time getting ready for the day, often having leftovers or some bare-bones breakfast. Something was better than nothing because if he skipped a meal, he would become extremely tired around midday. He would shower, and though most of the time there was hot water, there had been more than one occasion where he had to use cold water due to maintenance or the apartment building's water heater breaking down. His commute was annoying. His job was somewhat stimulating, but mostly tedious work. Some of his co-workers were nice, which was the highlight of his day. He used to come back home in the evening and some a bit outside his building because he just couldn't build up the strength to go inside and face his life. What remained of the day was spent watching television or playing games. Of course, that was what life felt like when he had the tumor. Prior to that, he was a lot more enthusiastic about life, and looked forward to facing new challenges which he could overcome. But even so, his life seemed extraordinarily mundane. Now, his life was nothing except simply extraordinary, and no comparison was needed. After all, Lex was standing on a planet an unknown number of galaxies away from the one he came from, in the middle of a battlefield consisting of numerous races, holding down a deity whose influence spanned across time and space, surrounded by devils, and cultivating a unique power to grow stronger. You, as a member of a race that does not have inherent resistance to the corruption of divine energy, are much more susceptible to its influence. If you wish to continue absorbing it, you must actively resist its sway. Lex was jolted awake, as if cold water had been splashed over him, when he heard Pelvalin's words. Even without realizing it, his thoughts had already fallen under the influence of divine energy. He could feel it acting on his confidence and ego, inflating it into arrogance and cocksure. He immediately steadied his mind and paid careful attention to himself and his surroundings as his body absorbed divine energy like a sponge. He could feel his cultivation rising bit by bit, and even his domination evolving further. Once again, he was exposed to energy that was far beyond his level, and his cultivation technique was using it to elevate his level on the cosmic ascendant spectrum. Any shortcomings that were left in his being after being upgraded using a dragon as a base template were being filled with that of a living deity. Lightsville, unfortunately, both of these beings were known for their excessive arrogance, and Lex had to be very careful not to develop such a trait himself. As Lex was planning out his cultivation path, one of the devils that was previously attacking him was having a panic attack. What the hell was this guy? Why was he more devilish than a devil, and more divine than a deity? He was like a nightmare, come to life. Chapter 880 How could they know? One of the devils roared in agony and pain as he held his injured hand. He had tried to gouge out Lex's eyes, but his eyelashes were sharper than the most well-forged swords, and directly cut off his fingertip. It would have at least been worth it if Lex was somewhat injured in the process, but he remained completely unharmed. This is not working. We should just retreat instead. The zealot is dead, and the deity is captured. If we're still around when he gets free, we'll be next, said another devil, who had fallen to his knees. The devils were a powerful race, superior to countless others. In more than one realm, they reigned supreme, and even had control over one of the primordial realms, Garvitz. They conducted deals with the most powerful races in existence, and dared to laugh in the face of dragons, even. There was no one who could deny their excellence. So the fact that they were so utterly helpless before this masked man, who could not even bother to defend himself, left them more broken than any actual beating could render them. It's no use. This planet is surrounded by a divine domain. We cannot exit so easily. I don't care. I'm going as far away as possible from this freak. The moment he kills the deity, and the divine domain evaporates, we can escape. I'll get on the nearest ship available. space in that region once again became fragile. Then, it broke completely and utterly. It was as if someone tried to catch a falling anvil with a single sheet of one-ply toilet paper. Lex, Ra, the devil, and Z were all caught unprepared as they fell into the void. Then again, how could they be prepared? None of them knew that within Ra's divine domain, the living embodiment of a law was hiding. The strength of that being far surpassed a heavenly immortal, although it was not quite at the realm of a celestial just yet. Its mere existence was too much for the fragile space to bear, and so it was destroyed, quite thoroughly and permanently. Midnight Inn. The doors finally opened, and the convention for oracles, prophets, and diviners ended. As the crowds emerged, they all wore solemn appearances, as if they had witnessed something extremely formidable. In fact, a majority of them directly went towards the Chamber of Secrets to wipe all memory of the event from their minds. Only in such a way could they be safe from the truth. Of course, they would leave hints for themselves to guide their future actions. But not all of them left. Vera Joel, who had organized this event, sat cross-legged on the stage where she had concluded the event, her thoughts unknown. A small fairy, barely the size of a child's finger, flew up to her and sat on her shoulder. "Why are you doing this, lovely?" she asked, her voice as sweet as candy. "It's because I want a future that my prophecies cannot predict," she said, her words carrying a weight of many things unsaid.